Right, let's begin. All right, we're really excited to have everyone here today. Our webinar is entitled Being Fremont in the Uinta Basin, a social examination through rock imagery with Elizabeth Hora. But before we launch into the webinar, to the presentation, we do want to give a land acknowledgement. So the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, Navajo, and Jicarilla Apache, people on whose traditional homelands this institution sits. Our mission-related work would not be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. We respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. Crow Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. We also just want to remind folks that we are a nonprofit organization, and your support is what keeps us going, really helps us day to day. If you feel like giving a charitable gift or supporting us in any way, you can find more information on our website at crowcanyon.org. I know that we're all old hands at Zoom right now, but I do just want to make sure that everyone remembers to put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat, in the Q&A, which is highlighted right there in red. And if you're having any difficulties whatsoever with Zoom, you can head over to Facebook, to our Facebook page, where this is being broadcasted live. We also want to remind folks that we have an awesome presentation next week as well, an awesome webinar by Caitlin Wicklach, the Salado Phenomenon in the Phoenix Basin, current research on ceramic composition and vessel shapes. That should be great. And so now, let me introduce you all to Elizabeth Hora. She's a public archaeologist at the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. Her work focuses on bringing science-based interpretations of archaeological data to the public and finding ways to protect the past at Utah's archaeological sites. Her current research, funded in part by the Utah Rock Art Research Association, examines Fremont social organization in the northern reaches of the Uinta Basin. She lives in Interlochen, Utah with her husband, Rhett, her preschooler, Asa, and their dog, Tico Brahe. So, without further ado, take it away, Elizabeth.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And hey, everybody. See that some folks are from my neck of the woods. I'm out here in Midway, Utah, if you know it, kind of by Park City. So let's get this kicked off. So I'm very excited to be here today. I was actually a Crow Canyon intern in the mid-2000s. And so it's really an honor to be on this side of the conversation and to be the person who gets to share some knowledge for a change. Today, I would like to introduce you to recent research in the Uinta Basin that uses rock imagery, also called rock art, to discover more about the Fremont people who lived there about 1,000 years ago. And if you're not familiar with the Fremont, you will be by the end of this, I promise. And before I start, I also have my own land acknowledgement. Because the work you are about to see was conducted in the Uinta Basin, I would like to offer this land acknowledgement before we get started. It is our honor and responsibility to acknowledge that we gather today on land that is sacred to all Indigenous people who came before us in this vast crossroad for the Utes, Goshutes, Paiutes, Shoshone, Navajo, Hopi, Eastern and Western Pueblos, and many more peoples and their ancestors. It has been their stewardship from time immemorial to care for this land and all of its inhabitants. We honor their memory, their physical presence in our state today, their ancestors' presence here in spirit, and we do so in our reverence for their resilience in preserving their connections to the Creator. We honor the people, we honor the land. Last thing before we get to the hard archaeology is I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Elizabeth Hora. I'm public archaeologist at the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. I use dating techniques to learn more about what the human landscape of the Uinta Basin would have looked like in the past. And more I've been examining Fremont rock imagery, which is about as far as you can get from, hard dating. Rock imagery, notoriously difficult to date, in fact. And because I am not native or indigenous myself, I'm careful when I go into these situations talking about rock imagery that I'm not suggesting an interpretation for what any of this could mean. I don't have access to that information about meaning. But I have started to wonder if I can apply archaeological science and specifically math like statistics to the study of rock imagery. The Uinta Basin has a lot of sites with petroglyphs and pictographs, and I've wondered what we could learn from how people portrayed themselves and each other graphically. So when I say graphically, I mean how they chose to write or draw or otherwise depict themselves on the rock surface. And when we're thinking about these rock imagery panels and sites, these are not Polaroids, right? These are a depiction of how people wanted to present themselves. So there's a lot of intentionality behind it, which is fantastic for understanding identity and understanding who people were. But I need to bring it back sometimes and remind us that what you're looking at is not necessarily a true fact of, person A interacted with person B in this way. It'll become clear later why this is so big for me. So I've been getting really deep into the weeds since I'm working in the Uinta Basin about what is classic vernal style. Vernal is the largest town in the Uinta Basin. We archaeologists like to just name things after places where we're at. So classic vernal style was originally recorded close to vernal. That's all it means. So classic vernal style, who made it? What does it mean? When were people engaging in creating this style of rock imagery? And so on and so forth. Classic vernal style was initially classified by Polly Schaafsma in the 1970s, and archaeologists have used this term ever since to talk about the rock imagery of the Uinta Fremont. It's kind of a one-to-one correspondence. If you have Uinta Fremont, then the rock imagery around there is going to be classic vernal style. But why was that? Why was that so closely related? And also, does this term serve its purpose 50 years later? Is classic vernal style keeping up with what we know about the Fremont? And can the rock imagery be used to further push our knowledge of the diverse, contentious, and vibrant peoples and societies that archaeologists are uncovering in the basin? So you're going to see a lot of images from my research, a lot of images that have been created by myself and a few of my research assistants who I'll call out at the end. This was from McConkey Ranch, if anyone knows where that is. It is actually publicly accessible. Highly recommend a trip up there. Okay, before we jump into the research, which is ongoing, let's talk about where we are in time and where we are in space. So I know that, Crow Canyon webinar, a lot of us are really familiar with the Four Corners area. We're pretty far afield from there, but we're in about the same time period. So I like to put our Fremont period, I ballpark it from about AD 0 to about AD 1300. There's a lot of discrepancy about dates. People pick up the Fremont constellation of attributes and things. People pick them up and put them down various times, especially at the beginning and end of the period. So AD 400, AD 0, it's fine by me. Just know that it's roughly contemporaneous with the basket maker and then ancestral Puebloan folks down in the Four Corners area. And we're a little ways north of the Four Corners. We're up here in sort of kind of the little east of the armpit, really, of Utah. So the Uinta Mountains are an east-west trending mountain range that extend from almost all the way from Park City, really, all the way into Colorado. And so it's in this area, in this transition zone between the dark part that's on the south here, and then the lighter part on the north. The dark part is the basin, the lighter part is the mountains. It's really in this transition zone that the Uinta Fremont culture was really flourishing. It's where we find a lot of village sites. It's where we find a lot of material culture. It's not going to be as dense as what you're expected to see in the Four Corners area, but by Utah standards, and especially, going further up into Wyoming and into the Rockies and Colorado, this is a hustling, bustling metropolis right along the Green River. So who were the Fremont? The Fremont extended broadly across much of what is now Utah, along the Colorado Plateau, just north of the Colorado Plateau. They followed along the Wasatch Front that goes, that's kind of where Salt Lake City is, extending out east towards Nevada, and then extending out as far west as Colorado. South is, the Colorado Plateau, so almost nearly Arizona, and then north up to about the Snake River Plain. So now you're into Idaho. So really roughly Utah, which is strange. But who were the Fremont? What were they doing during this time? The Fremont are unique, and they are distinct from the Pueblos south of them and the Plains folks all around them and the Basin folks to the west. They're distinct because they blended together farming and hunting and gathering. These were folks who would pick up and put down different ways of life as it suited them. As the climate changed, if climate became more wet, more favorable to hunting and gathering, fewer people would engage in farming. We see that more people would engage in hunting and gathering. It's a great way to live. When the environment would really put the squeeze on people, when we entered periods of drought, we expect to see more farmers, fewer people that are hunting and gathering. But it's important that we know about the two of them together. The farmers and the foragers were really able to complement each other. Farmers would have a pretty steady supply of food and a concrete home base for people to return to. And the foragers would have not only foraged for foods that are extraordinarily nutritious, meat that can be, somewhat prestigious, we're believing, but they're also going to bring in exotic trade goods as well. So that's really, if you're living in a village, you're linked to the outside world. But these groups were not themselves static. It's not like people were 50-50. I'm always farming. I'm always foraging. In the course of a human lifetime, you could weave in and out of both as the situation required. Like I said, you can do it because that's what the environment is pushing you towards. You could also do it because that's where you are in your personal stage of life. Consider you're born young male in maybe a village, say White Rocks Village in the Uinta Basin. You grow up in that village, you're helping your family tend their farm, take care of everything that way. And then you're a teenager and you're getting kind of flighty. Like, people in this town know too much about you. Maybe they're not into it. Maybe you're not into the reputation that you've developed. You're like 16. Your uncle's coming through. He is foraging. That's where he's at. He's 24. He's ready to sow his wild oats. And you think, I'm going with my uncle. Like, I cannot take it here anymore. So you blast out of there. You blast out of the village and you're going to go forage for a long time until you feel like you're ready to settle down and find another village. Not to say that hunters and gatherers, foragers were all male. Certainly it was groups of people that were made up of families, in equal parts men, women, and children were in there too. But just saying, that's an example of within the course of one life, you start out in a village, then you forage for a while, and maybe you end your life in a village. So like I said, the Fremont were pretty tied to agriculture. In fact, we start to see Fremont artifacts and sort of a Fremont way of life with the advent of corn, beans, and squash. These came up from the South. They came up from probably the Pueblo world. And it's unclear right now, although I think we're starting to see who those folks were, if the corn, beans, and squash traveled, or if the people traveled with the corn, beans, and squash. We're going to suggest it's probably a mixture of both. Probably a lot of people did come in. So the Fremont foodways, really important because it's really anchoring us in sort of that diverse experience. And you're going to see a lot of it reflected in every part of the archaeological record. It was kind of a head scratcher for archaeologists for a long time about who the Fremont were, because they are blending these two parts of, the human experience so frequently. And as we start thinking about the Fremont, who they were, what they were doing, they're not just subsistence living, right? It's not all chasing food in one way or the other, whether it's chasing corn or chasing sheep. These were folks who had vibrant lives, who had social lives. And I want to find out in my research a little bit more about that. So here are some household items that we come across. We are fortunate here in Utah that we have a lot of dry alcoves that we can, that we do find some artifacts in. We do have a looting problem. Everyone does. So these are some of the things that were available from collections that have been either submitted to our office or like surrendered to our office. And these are a lot of things from the Uinta Heritage Museum that when you're going out to check out McConkey Ranch, you can head over to the Uinta Heritage Museum and see them. So things like sandals, people were also wearing a very specific type of Fremont moccasin that we'll see later. We have some bone gaming pieces. Those are always super fun. It's, you know, it's people's pastime. It's things that people do when they're together. Down here, I hope you can see my cursor. We have a particular type of metate. This doesn't really give you a good sense of the scale, but this is a pretty big honkin' metate. And it's a little difficult to see because it's out of vesicular basalt. Or maybe it's an ash. But anyway, we've got a little bit of a divot basin here and then a big grinding basin down here. This is particular of what we call a Utah style metate because they are so closely associated with the Fremont, and the Fremont's footprint is so closely associated with Utah. The last thing I want to show you is this reed mat. We find reed mats in so many alcoves out here because even if you were hunting and gathering, even if you were foraging, living light on your feet, you still wanted to be comfy and you still wanted to be clean. So these reed mats and sometimes juniper bark mats were used by people to create a nice living surface. You could sit on here and, you know, play with your bone game pieces. You could gamble, you could kick your shoes off. It was going to be a nice sanitary surface. And when it started to get dusty or yucky, take it outside, you shake it out, you're good to go. It's light, it travels well, and we do find them in an awful lot of alcoves, probably for that reason. So life was comfy. These are just sort of some of the things, right? We also had rabbit skin blankets that you would use as like a rabbit skin coat in the wintertime. Things would be, you know, like feathered things would come into the world too. So you would have like amazing, you know, regalia. And then of course, color. We'll talk a lot about color in just a few minutes, but color was really important in the Fremont world too. We just don't always see these things in the archaeological record because everything kind of turns into a browny gray color. But people were really vibrant. So the Fremont as a term, researchers have really struggled with it, right? So it's Steve Sims and David Madsen in 1998 who first recommended that we think of Fremont less of a socially cohesive group of people and more of a behavioral complex, in their words. So instead of an archaeologically observable constellation of things like pottery and Utah-style metates and rock imagery types, we're thinking of them more as a constellation of behaviors, like the tendency to grow corn, beans, and squash, while another segment of society engages in hunting and gathering. So already we're starting to shift our focus of what really is Fremont from their things to their doings, right? And we're going to shift it one phase further here in a moment. So they noted that this ability of the Fremont to change their way of life to fit new environmental and social challenges made this an extremely resilient pattern of life. The Fremont were here for nearly 1,000 years, right? From 400 AD to 1300 AD. And they were doing approximately the same thing throughout that time. They had a traditional culture that, you know, they were holding on to their traditions fast because they were adaptively working for them. It was a great adaptation to the environment and to the social order at the time. So we've got that baseline, right? We've got our stuff, we've got our way of life. Now let's start thinking about who folks were. So a few researchers, Linda McNeil, David Schall, and Scott Ortman are proposing that at least in the Uinta Basin, two different groups of people might have been cohabiting there, and that their ways of life were different enough to be complementary, and archaeologically, we observe them both as being Fremont. So let's think about our migration in. So these researchers are proposing that about 2,000 years ago, the Central Mesa Verde area was a crucible for people. There was a lot going on out there. And if you dive into some of the literature, what you're going to see is an area where people are experimenting with social structure and ways of organizing themselves. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. Places like Eagle Ridge, we see that it ends in death and destruction. Other places, like a lot of places in San Juan County, it appears to work. So we have people who are maybe ethnically different, certainly linguistically different, bonking around, joining up into societies, into villages, and then leaving, joining and leaving, right? Out of this crucible of people who are bonking around and people who are linguistically distinct, we have two groups of folks that move northward into northern Utah. The Proto-Kiowa-Tanoan speakers and pre-Hopi speakers. These are not to say that, they were one group of people or people who felt like they were socially connected. We're just talking about the languages that they speak. And we're also not necessarily saying, although we're kind of saying, we're not necessarily saying, that all of these folks who are speaking a pre-Hopi language, that they would find themselves, they would call themselves Hopi. We don't know how they were socially organized in this way. Nevertheless, for a few hundred years, people are filtering northward. And folks start arriving in the Uinta Basin really between about 400 and 1000 AD. This is where we see a huge influx of our population numbers. Our population really skyrockets throughout that time. And I mean, it doubles, triples, quadruples, quintuples, like it shoots up. And then at about 1000, 1000 AD, that's really our pinnacle of when we see the most people in the basin. So the basin fills up with folks. And we think it's filling up with people who are not just bringing their corn and dropping it off, but bringing their corn and leaving it there with them. And they're staying and they're having kids there and they're creating a pretty robust society there, right? If people were there for 1,000 years in the basin, like this is overall, and what I would say, like a positive experiment. This worked great for these guys. But not forever, right? All good things come to an end. And so we actually start to see a big out-migration from the region between about 1000 and 1100 AD. Pre-Hopi speakers start to migrate south. They have cousins in the south. Folks in San Juan are also pre-Hopi speaking. And so we see their course through the West Havaputz Plateau. If you guys are familiar with 9 Mile Canyon, a lot of the 9 Mile Canyon sites really come alive around this time. We see a greater population in 9 Mile Canyon for a while as these folks are really filtering down southward and out of the basin. And after about 1300, the Proto-Kiowa-Tanoan speakers are migrating northward into Yellowstone. And they're going to continue their journey and finally become Kiowa speakers well after they eventually leave Yellowstone, head up and over the Rocky Mountains and come down into the Northern Plains. That's where they really sort of, put their dot on the map and say, this is our ethnogenesis. So what is that? What are the implications of that for classic vernal style, right? So we, in the 50 years since Polly Schaafsma published her piece in the 1970s, we haven't really updated what it means to have classic vernal style, right? So maybe we didn't need to update it when we were talking about a behavioral adaptation, because it's really hard to get from rock imagery to behavioral adaptation, right? It can be done, but it's pretty difficult to see how this as an adaptive strategy is going to net you more rabbits. So we didn't do a heck of a lot of rock imagery research then. But now that we're starting to think about people as linguistically different and perhaps socially different, now that we're really cracking the door into the social structure world that in the Four Corners, you guys have been really like swimming in those waters for decades. Now that we're finally getting there, it's time to take another look at this rock imagery. So the emphasis of early classification was really in geographic variation. Now we're able to create something more of a temporal variation, maybe even a linguistic variation. New work is coming out that's going to build on this old classification in ways that reflect a new patterned variation that we're able to see in the archaeological record of the Uinta Basin. So when I visited sites this spring with local expert Darlene Corner and Linda McNeil, we noticed something. And here I'm going to use this is a composite stitched image from a site that we call the Wilkin site. I'm going to use this as an example, but we saw this again and again repeated. So here it is. It's a complicated, and I would say even confusing, composite photograph of just one portion of this large site. And if you're able to really see it very well, I know that the contrast isn't great, but there's a lot going on here. Most of us are probably picking up on some dots that are lined up, some etches that look like faces, and of course that big concentric circle in the right, but it looks jumbled and confusing. And when people walk up to sites like this is what you're presented with, is this wave of information, and it's really hard to tease it apart because these are the layered remains of several different groups of people drawing one on top of another. So we're looking at hundreds of years of people essentially writing on the same page. In the field, we analyzed which layers were on top of or below one another. And from there, we could determine individual drawings of people, or what we called anthropomorphs, or anthros for short. And so from here on out, you'll hear me refer to each one of these identifiable human figures as an anthro. In the lab, we drew about 500 anthros. It's a lot. And we gave them all individually coded names. Each of these figures represents a depiction of a single person, although a lot of them look like they're missing pieces. So let's start investigating what we got here. Why are they missing pieces? Before we go too much farther, I do want to mention, so when you see colors on here, we're using dots, we're doing pointillism to record a lot of our anthros, but when you see color like this, we did try to color match to the stuff that was below and behind. In this case, this figure is actually behind. If we could zoom in, you would see that this pendant is pecked straight over this colored area. So we know before and after, right? We know that this pigment was here before this large anthro. And, I'll leave it to other experts like Linda McNeil to go more into it in the future, but we suspect that this might be a Barrier Canyon style rock imagery anthropomorph, honestly, that someone was putting their anthro on top of. And so this was done super intentionally. I'm not really getting into that today, but it's cool to think about. So this feller here, we're just going to isolate him for just a minute. I'm fairly confident it is a him. I'm fairly confident he's male presenting. So what we're missing are colors that don't last. I mean, we've got some of this Barrier Canyon stuff, and boy howdy, whatever those guys were using, that sticks to rocks. Super great. But not every pigment sticks to rocks that well. Missing information, colors. Let's dive in. So ochres are naturally occurring sediments in the earth. They're clays that have been dyed by hematite, I think FeO2, and they come in a whole range of colors. You can get ochres in a crazy array of brown, red, yellow, even things like purple, orange is out there, wild colors of red and yellow. So these pigments, they would be made by, mixing a binder and mixing a carrier substance and put on the rock. And they wouldn't last, especially if you were in a place that had a lot of wind, a lot of sun, a lot of rain or water, or, animals or plants brushing up against stuff. They just don't last. And especially when you think that these rock imagery depictions could be as old as the Roman Colosseum, like, hey man, they're doing pretty good. Color just doesn't last on these things. And we see that, throughout the ancient world. Some examples of color from other Fremont rock imagery areas are here in the San Rafael swell. We have a few different colors of red going on. And I think the white surrounding it might actually be honestly, truly a white pigment. Sometimes you see these whites and they're chalking, which is not ideal. I think those aren't chalk. I think that because it's super high up on a cliff. This guy, he is chalked in white. That's probably not super real. Maybe it is. I can't really tell. I didn't take this photograph. This is a pictograph that is somewhat insultingly called All American Man. This is down in the Bears Ears area, I believe. And you can see he's got blue and red and white and just such vibrant colors, again, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later. So we do think that when we're seeing people like this, they're cut off at the knee, that might be because they were depicted as having perhaps a red leg. People still today do paint themselves. A lot of it is going to be in that nice bright red ochre. They paint themselves for various purposes. And so this depiction might have been trying to capture that red ochre that he would put maybe on his feet, maybe on his hands and arms, but that washed away. So we see a lot of times that people have that trapezoidal form that we know so well from classic vernal style, that they're missing arms and that they're missing some other critical parts of the human body. So here's another example. This is also from, is this from a conky ranch? Actually, I don't know if this is from a conky off the top of my head. We had 500 anthros. They all kind of blend together because they all are kind of the same style. But you can see here that, down here in the lower right, we have a really fleshed out person, and we have some part of either a shirt or maybe a painted design on their torso that's going into a beaded belt. And they have a nice beaded collar as well. Here too, we see this repetition of a beaded collar, this line. This was a red pigment. The red is indicating that this was some ochre that we did see. And then that belt. So we know that, okay, this is another anthropomorph. And then getting, even more into the weeds. Here we just have his collar. So we would count this as an anthropomorph as well for the purposes of our research. This is another anthro, even though all we have is a little bit of torso, a nice belt, and some of that either shirt or line on his torso, indicating that this is a whole person. Also, we have 500 anthros because this head does count as an anthropomorph. So recall I mentioned that we were going to talk a little bit about how these are not Polaroids. This is not a Polaroid, right? This is a depiction of a person who is carrying a human head, who, you might want to interpret that as bleeding. If you want to, go right ahead. Not here to stop you. Because, this is somewhat gruesome. But I don't think that there's any reason to believe that this is an actual human person who had an actual human person's head on a string hanging from their arm, right? You can draw whatever you can dream up. Sure, maybe you've seen this. Maybe you've seen this person. Maybe this is recording this event that happened. But we do have dozens and dozens of heads like this. And what we don't have is archaeological evidence of trauma from warfare that's any more or any less than anywhere else in the Fremont world. So we're just not seeing people who are becoming decapitated. We're not seeing that sort of injury on the neck, and we're not even seeing more like defensive wounds than you would expect. So probably this is depicting something that's not real life. This is not a Polaroid. I'm not sure if this is something that is more, figurative, or something a little bit more literal of people, but it doesn't matter. What I'm here to say is we counted this as an anthro because a lot of times this had coded data in it. They would have a weeping eye motif, or they would have pigment. Never did they have headdresses, and never did they have any jewelry below the neck, although sometimes they do have nice earrings or ear bobs. This person here, you can see they've got ear bobs. This is probably an ear bob. But in a lot of cases, we just don't have a lot of information, but we felt like we had enough to say, this is an individual, and this is an individual that is depicted perhaps in opposition, certainly in service to this overall image. But we think that there's going to be some interesting data to pull from who is featured as a decapitated head. Okay, out of the grim and gruesome into the archaeological evidence. So without all of these colors that show a complete anthropomorph, and with the disadvantage of all of those layers on top of each other, it can be hard to see the people behind the rock imagery. Fortunately, we have an archaeological record that can fill in some of the gaps. So I have a few examples of clothing and jewelry that are just going to help us see who the Fremont were by how they chose to visually represent themselves. Again, not a Polaroid. And I'm also going to give another caveat. You're going to see beads and whatever. I don't know where these beads, how they were arranged on the human form, because we don't have that information archaeologically. What I can do is make some suggestions. Some of these I've put on here because honestly, they're beautiful pieces. So let's get started. Starting at the top with ear bobs or earrings. So right here, right below this person's kind of squarish head, which is an interesting feature, they've got something round. Although this isn't perfectly round, and I actually don't think it's going to be an ear bob, this is a beautiful piece of malachite. This was found in the Uinta Basin. We don't have any way of knowing if it would have been a necklace, an earring, part of a belt. So we're going to take some creative liberties here. So speaking of necklaces, this person has two necklaces. They have a choker out of very small beads, and the Fremont people who drew this were careful to indicate tiny, tiny, tiny stipples. And then they have a 3-layer or 3 strings of beads. So here we have evidence of some types of beads we have. Most of the beads that are being found in the Uinta Basin are stone, often slate, sometimes gypsum, which is pretty interesting. The gypsum tend to be pendants or big chunky pony beads. This guy, I hope you guys can see some of the texture. This has been really intentionally worked and incised. So it's fairly cool. And then this is an olivella shell bead. We know that down south in the Pueblo world, for a long time, people were importing olivella shell beads until they gained a lot of economic power, probably, and political sway, and were able to tell people in California, where these beads are harvested, or the shell is harvested, like, we have our own artisans, like, just give us the whole shell. You don't have to give us the worked piece and, have that artisan markup on it. So here, we don't have enough evidence to know if there are olivella shell artisans crafting the whole animal down into beads. We don't have that here, but we do have evidence of trade with places as far away as California, right? And this malachite, we don't necessarily know where this is, but we also have turquoise, and we have abalone shell. It's from the Californias. Turquoise would be from, southern Arizona, maybe even Mexico. So these guys were engaged in that sort of long distance trade, like their Puebloan neighbors that they were probably related to. Moving on down the line, this person is wearing something that's, maybe a kilt, maybe an apron, could be a menstrual apron. Jury's out on that one. But it's exciting because they have these cool pony beads at the bottom. They have these big blobby beads that it's neat. So here are a couple examples of that gypsum that I was telling you about. And then I threw this in because this is another very cool bead. This is actually a fossil that's been drilled through. So whether that was a pendant, whether that was an ear bob, whether that was part of the belt, that here, this is also often depicted as being individual beads, unclear, but I wanted you guys to see it. Also, these lines, they could have been, you know, buffalo, something absorbent, could even have been imported cotton. People were not growing cotton in the basin, but they might have imported it up. And then the last piece that I have to share, just so that you can start thinking about these people as, you know, more than just the drawings that you see only parts of. Here's a Fremont hawk moccasin. And you can go ahead and ignore this cream colored tie here. It's just holding the moccasin together in a display. So this person, creative liberties again, you can kind of see some individual toes. A lot of classic vernal style anthros were depicted with very marked toes, but a lot of them were also depicted with really cool boots, like Ugg boot looking things that went like up the calf. So we know that people were making that sort of footwear. Here's an example of it. So this is a deer hide. And it's usually made of one solid piece that's been of a deer hawk that's been folded up and over and laced at the top. It's called a Fremont hawk moccasin. All right. We're gonna just take a quick deep breath because this has been a lot of information. So we're just gonna take it down, look at beautiful Ashley Creek for a minute. I'm gonna tie it together for just a second. We've covered a lot of pretty esoteric information. So I've suggested that the people that we have called Fremont for nearly 100 years might not be one group of people after all. And I've told you that the rock imagery that we're used to seeing is not only missing a ton of information through color loss, but it also, when you first walk up to it, looks hopelessly jarbled because of centuries of people drawing right on top of one another. And now I've asked you to keep one more thing in your head, and that's a ton of artifacts with all of their just wild variation, incredible things that people do. It's getting late in the day. So why am I subjecting you good people to this punishment? Because we are about to have some really amazing research coming up that will change the way we think of the Fremont. We've already been moving forward in leaps and bounds in our radiocarbon dating, in understanding a lot of the subsistence agriculture, and in understanding, you know, the Proto-Kiowa Tanoan, pre-Hopi speaking kind of stuff. Here's what's coming next. So partially it's what my colleague Linda McNeil is working on. We're really excited to see what she's doing with Hopi, especially looking at rock imagery, looking for, you know, maybe a direct historic analogy here. But what I'm doing is I'm looking at these images through statistics. So I believe we can see different peoples and change over time through changing clothing and jewelry. For 50 years, we've assumed that classic vernal style is one thing that represents one people. And now if we're thinking that the Fremont were multicultural, then it would make sense if we see more than one variation within classic vernal style. So we've encoded those nearly 500 anthropomorphs. And when I say nearly, it's like 496. And we've examined their face paint, their head shape. Some of those folks had very square heads, super interesting. Their headdresses, got a lot of variation there. Their jewelry, including their ear bobs, their chokers, their necklaces, their sashes, and their arm cuffs. Their clothing, including their shirts or tunics, their body paint on their upper half, or their, on the lower half, their skirts, kilts, or aprons. Also their footwear. Also, sometimes it looks like maybe they've got leggings on. We are in the process of getting all of that lined out. So my research assistants, who have been amazing and the most fabulous ever, they are currently quality checking some of those data so that we make sure that when we push the big red button, we get results. And the big red button is going to be either a principal component analysis or a factor analysis to determine if there is statistically significant patterning with what people wear. I'm hypothesizing that there's going to be pattern similarities between anthros in the data set and important distinctions between groups, and that these patterns should indicate 2 or more different cultures and time periods. Like I said, people were looking at this geographically before. So, Polly Shaftsma, who did the original classification, said, I think I see something different in the Cub Creek area than in the Dry Fork area. Now we've got really fine grain analysis about radiocarbon dates and when people were active in these areas. Maybe we're not necessarily seeing a geographic shift. Maybe we're seeing a temporal shift, or maybe we're seeing a cultural shift. So we're really excited that we're about to crack open this box. And also potentially within this group, we'll be able to see office holders like rain priests or calendar priests, people who hold particular religious, ceremonial, or political office, and who are featured on rock imagery wearing the regalia that would distinguish them as that office holder, right? And something that could distinguish someone as an office holder might be those heads that we do find so often, the subjugation of someone. Maybe that is important. And, I do apologize that I don't have the results of this work to share with you right now, but I hope that I was able to give you enough to chew on here tonight to leave you inspired to learn more about Utah's incredible peoples and cultures. And if you're watching and you are a high school student, an undergraduate, or even a graduate, there is a research project here. There's many research projects here. Hit me up because we need help. We have a lot of data now. Before we take off here tonight and before we open it up to questions and thank yous, I just want to remind you that it's important that all of us do our part to protect these sites. We are losing everything every day due to human actions. So I want to remind you that when you visit archaeological sites, please take nothing, leave nothing, and watch your step. Even the smallest things we do are recorded in the archaeological record and have effects throughout time. I mean, like you saw that people were layering their stuff on top of stuff on top of stuff and making it jumbled. We do that too. And I know that probably no one watching here tonight is scratching their names on stuff, but just please be cautious about touching these things, about getting too close. Watch your step. Make sure you're not stepping on a hearth to get to see something that's cool. And I have so many people to thank. So this is a massive project, and it absolutely could not have been possible without support from the office I work at, the Utah State Historic Preservation Office, and a very generous grant by the Utah Rock Art Research Association. My research assistants, Justin Fulmer and Kate Anderson, are incredible. They never want to see another anthro, but God bless them. Darlene Corner is amazing. She showed me throughout the basin. The Bar v. Bar Corporation owns and operates McConkey Ranch. Dr. Larry Wilkin allowed us access to his property very generously. Thank you. And the photographs, some of which you saw tonight, are from the Uinta County Heritage Museum and the Utah Fieldhouse Natural History State Park Museum. So, phew, that was a lot. I think we're good to take questions. We've got about 12 minutes left. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, that was so great, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. We've already got thanks in the chat right now. It was awesome.
Cool.
So yeah, we've got a lot of questions, and I'll start fielding them. I just want to remind everyone that we want to be respectful of Elizabeth's time, so we will end things at 5, and I'll get to the questions. We also had a little bit of issue with Facebook Live, and we apologize for that, but we're glad you're all here. So I'll just launch into some questions. I have a question I'm going to start off with, and it's a selfish one. You said, hunting and gathering is kind of very different from ancestral Pueblo hunting and gathering. And I'm just wondering, are there any ways, like specific ways that we know of that it was really different?
Yeah, so we see in the rock imagery that people are extremely concerned with buffalo too, but bighorn sheep, which maybe is the same in the Pueblo world. But when I say it's different, it's really just the proportion of the population. We have at times a preponderance of people engaging in hunting and gathering. It's also going to be patterned regionally. If you're kind of more of a montane living person, you're probably hunting and gathering more. Our villages are few and far between. Our villages aren't as large or as long-lived as in the Pueblo world. And so that has implications for how people are foraging. But they're hunting the same things, they're gathering the same things. Their medicines are likely fairly similar as well.
Another one that we have, one of the first questions that we got is, it's multi-part. So who designated the title term Fremont? Is there evidence that this imagery is Apachean, or could this be some variant of basket maker, ancestral Pueblo basket maker? Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so the term Fremont itself is actually named for the Fremont River that's in sort of like southern central Utah. And the Fremont River itself was named for John C. Fremont. So the Fremont River is just the first place that someone saw something that was a patterned variation that was different from the Pueblo world. It was Noel Morse in the 1920s, I want to say. And he was like, I think this is different enough to deserve its own type of society. So again, back in the day, we were taking, traits of physical things. Types of pottery was actually the really big one. And he said, this doesn't look like Pueblo pottery. It's gray on the inside. It's not a whiteware. They weren't doing like a whitewash on it. So that's where the term Fremont comes from. As far as Apachean ties, I know there's another researcher, Carol Patterson, who is looking at Apachean ties. What I've suggested here tonight is not to say, it's only going to be pre-Hopi speakers and Proto-Kiowa-Tanoan. This is just what we've recognized so far. We do have a couple dozen modern tribes that are descended from or tie their ancestry back to Utah and the Fremont peoples. And I'm in no way excluding any of that. It's probably a lot more complex than we're even talking about yet.
Yeah. This is a great segue into what you're talking about with kind of linguistic groups. One question in here is kind of, how do you know what languages people are speaking? So what's the evidence for, Proto-Kiowa-Tanoan and, pre-Hopi or something like that?
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to direct you to the original literature on this. Let me grab it. It's like, I'll put it back up on the screen too, because it's not my research. I am not a linguist. Zipping all the way back. Okay, adapted from McNeil and Shull 2018 and Ortman and McNeil 2018. So Ortman and McNeil are really getting into the language aspect. And I want to say it's kind of more Kiowa focused. McNeil and Shull is really looking at ties between the languages, the linguistic groups, and sort of their modern things that they, modern artifacts they have, modern things they use. So things like, let me hop back over here. We've got, this is a good example. We have someone here with something that looks like maybe it's a fringed stick, like a rain stick. In that piece, Linda McNeil and David Shull also suggest bear masks. They're suggesting for the Kiowa things like shield warriors. So I would refer you to those, because this is not my original research, and it's just been inspiring more than anything else. They did an incredible job.
Another question here is, kind of a practical one about actually photographing rock imagery. So Dan Seeley says, I have photographed some pictographs with weathered red ochre. Do you have any suggestions from a photography standpoint to make the ochre pop?
Yeah. So if you're using your phone, there's an app called D-Stretch that just applies filters. But one thing you can do is in Photoshop, kind of apply those same filters yourself. And so what that's going to do is upplay some of the red and downplay some of the blue, or some of the yellow, or some of the cyan, different filters, right? And so In D-Stretch, you can scroll through and find the filter that you like. But honestly, other than playing around in Photoshop, I don't know how to necessarily make those colors pop. When I'm out in the field, what I use professionally is D-Stretch. Gosh, I'm sorry. That wasn't maybe as helpful as I want it to be.
Oh, great. That was a great answer. This is another really interesting question. Is Uinta like a strictly geographic term when you're using it, or are there anything else about like the Fremont sites there that distinguish it from others?
Yeah, so the Uinta Fremont is referring to that cluster of artifact traits, right? So Fremont is kind of referring to more of the pattern of life, and we see that Uinta Fremont is doing the same behavioral adaptation that the rest of the world is for Fremont. But in the Uinta Fremont, we see a particular type of Uinta grayware. So people are making grayware pottery. People are drawing in the classic vernal style, right? It's kind of tautological in this way. They equal each other. But the classic vernal style is defined as sort of a trapezoidal form, often a very boxy head, and then a lot of interest in the regalia that people have on their clothing and jewelry. So we do see that bleeding out into Colorado, into like Douglas Creek Arch or Douglas Arch Creek, I kind of forget. And then up into Wyoming, they're following the Green River all the way up and over. And then down south into the Tavaputs Plateau, we see, as probably as those pre-Hopi folks are migrating down, they're bringing some of that Uinta culture with them as well. So we are finding like Uinta graywares and things that look a little bit more like classic vernal style south in the Tavaputs Plateau. So when I say Uinta Fremont, I'm talking about sort of a core and periphery model, sort of, not quite.
Makes sense. Another question here is kind of getting back to the in-migration and maybe out-migration as well. Has any of the like DNA been done on corn or beans and squash, like compared to ancestral Pueblo areas?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. You have found a gap in my knowledge. I know that the Fremont world, we have a particular corn called Fremont dent corn, because our growing season's a little bit shorter. And especially up here in the Uintas, I mean, Dry Fork, where a lot of this stuff comes from, they got about 4.5, 5 feet of snow this year. So, and it didn't melt off until late April, early May. So shortened growing seasons, hedging your bets with a different sort of corn. So I can find out if you want to email me. I'll see if I can help you find out more about corn, but I don't know that one.
It's super for the person who asked that question. It's a super active area of research right now. People are still filling these models, right? So
that's amazing.
It's very exciting.
We've got lots of samples. So if someone wants to come up here, there's a thesis or a PhD for you.
Astroth has asked about a very particular artifact, but it sounds interesting, so I'm gonna read this one. Kirk says, "Are you familiar with the Fremont goggles that are in the museum down outside of Price in Castledale, I believe?" And I guess if you are you familiar with that?
No. No, and I should be. I'm actually gonna Google it. What does Fremont goggles mean? I'm not seeing it anywhere. Quickly.
Well, there are apparently some goggles.
Woven goggles. That's interesting. No, you know what? We'll ask Tim Riley. Email me and I'll get back to you with an answer.
Let's see, what else do we have here? How do you know the layering is later over earlier? And so could a layered image indicate a new conceptualization of something, and 2 or 3 layered images were used? So how does that kind of tie together?
Yeah, such a great question. So we actually have a few different ways that we figure out our layering. One is the nice one, if you have something that's colored and you've pecked over the colored area, right? That's so easy to see. The other one is, it's a lot of pecking over pecking, petroglyph over petroglyph. And so we try to match things like ear bobs to face makeup to headdresses by style and depth of etching, a little bit by repatination. These are not always great right? Because humans can vary their style, and they do. And the earth can vary its repatination, and it does. But where we couldn't determine that in the field, we just didn't. But in most cases, we're able to determine anthro and anthro. We maybe can't get the time periods. In other cases, we can get the time periods. Once you've really like pulled out like anthro A and anthro B, you almost always can find a part of their bodies that are overlapping and crisscrossing. And the reason is that people were, it looks like, pretty intentionally targeting the anthros of earlier folks and pecking theirs directly on top of it, maybe to obliterate it, maybe to repurpose it, reappropriate it. Unclear.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. All right, so we're gonna call it here, Elizabeth. It's 5 o'clock. Thank you so much for making the time for us today. We really appreciate it. We really do. There's tons of thanks in the chat. Yeah.
And
so
I put my email in the chat.
Okay.
I realized
I
have my social, but not my email.
Okay. So anyone that wants to ask questions, now's your chance to look at Elizabeth's email in the chat, because we're getting ready to close things. So thanks again, Elizabeth. I hope everyone has a good day. I hope you have a good day, especially.
Thank you so much. This was so wonderful. I appreciate you guys. Thanks.
All right. Bye, everyone. See you next week.